Better late than never. It's time for our weekly best deck roundup for Marvel Snap. Let's go ahead and dive on into the details to see how things are looking after our latest over-the-air update. Like to kick this week off, talking about the obvious boogeyman in the room, the Airshim decks, still touting an over 30% play rate on the public trackers. Airshim had both Blob and Mockingbird get adjusted downward in our most recent OTA, but that hasn't slowed this archetype down any at all. Its performance is actually stronger than it was when I recorded last week's best decks roundup. I think this difference isn't due to large part optimizations being found in the archetype. Specifically, all the best performing Airshim deck lists are now playing Dr. Octopus as well as Leech, and this makes sense to me from a game theory perspective as they actively solve problems this archetype has. Specifically, they strip your opponent's tech cards like Shang-Chi and Shadow King that are typically used to keep up with the large threats that Airshim puts into play. They're also incredibly disruptive against other linear decks that were able to go over the top of Airshim consistently. The two that come to my mind are Silver Surfer and Hitmonkey slash Bounce decks that really care about having both their on reveals and being able to sequence their cards in a specific manner, really suffer against Leech and Doc Ock. Another thing worth noting that is an unintended consequence of the Mockingbird change is that her being 6 energy means she's now able to be generated by Nick Fury. There is not that large of a pool of 6 energy cards that Nick is pulling from, meaning with some consistency, you're getting an extra copy of one of the most powerful cards in your archetype when playing Nick out. Obviously, we're going to talk about more than just Aeroshim in this roundup. There are some other deck lists that still look like they are competitive. That being said, it's definitely feeling much harder to brew in this format when a deck that's heading towards 30% play rate is featuring Leech, Dr. Octopus, and even Goliath as ways to make sure your cards aren't going to get to function the way you intended them to when you put them in your deck. Past Aeroshim, our top performing category this week, has a lone other deck list standing tall, and that is this tried and true Darkhawk stature variation. I think from a game theory perspective, it makes sense why this is the Darkhawk deck that's still having a strong performance despite the innovations that the Aeroshim archetype is making. Specifically, this deck list has plenty of big numbers in Miles, Stature, and Hawk that it can put into play after getting leeched. It has Shang-Chi to chop down Dr. Octopus, as well as a bunch of cards that can move around the board, so Doc Ock is way less likely to fully lock you into a specific lane. And this deck list isn't just a one-trick trying to gun after Aeroshim specifically, because there's still, the other 70% of the format. This deck list has just generically good disruptive cards and a powerful proactive game plan that lets it keep up in a variety of situations. As far as higher series substitutions go here, you obviously need Darkhawk, and then I would say you need one of Jeff, Silk, or Nocturne. You could replace other missing movers with a combination of Nightcrawler and Spider-Man slash Polaris. White Widow is definitely also a nice to have, but not necessary, easily being replaced by something like Lizard or Medusa. That's a high quality 2 energy card. Moving along to our high potential category, we have some newer decks with smaller sample sizes but promising statistic, kicking things off with a Gwenpool Movers deck. Again, similar to the Miles deck list that we looked at before this one featuring Darkhawk, I think this archetype is well positioned into a world where there are lots of Dr. Octopuses running around. Jeff, Nocturne, and Vision, all cards that when Doc Ock pulls them into play, are going to be able to fan out across the board in a way where they just gave you an advantage as opposed to locking you into a particular lane. This deck list has a dash of disruption thanks to Mobius and Shang-Chi, and then it plays 3 different scaling threats at the bottom end of its curve in Thena, Craven, and Angela that can all scale up to be formidable numbers thanks to the synergies they have with the rest of our cards played out over the course of the game. As far as higher series cards go for this deck list, I would say Thena, Kitty Pryde, and Silk are the 3 important ones to have, as they are responsible for your scaling numbers at the bottom end of your curve. Jeff the Baby Land Shark could be substituted for something like Nightcrawler. Mobius is just a generic 3 energy tech card that you could replace with something like Luke Cage or even a Red Guardian. Nocturne could substitute for a different 3/5 that gives you some movement synergies such as Spider-Man. And then Gwenpool's a little bit tricky since she gives you raw numbers, but I think swapping her out for something like an Enchantress would give you an edge in certain matchups where Gwenpool wouldn't even punch nearly as hard. Our second high potential deck list this week is a clutter variation featuring our latest card release in Ajax, as well as Hazmat as his primary enabler. Clutter lists like this have been in and out of the top performing and high potential in these roundups for some time now, and it's a consistently top tier archetype. It's not clear to me from looking at the data if Ajax plus Hazmat is actually a meaningful addition slash innovation to this archetype, or if it's just the latest variation of taking the new card plus an enabler and shoving it into an existing best deck where it kind of makes sense. As far as higher series cards go here, White Widow followed by Cannonball are definitely the two most important ones. White Widow is just a generically good 2 energy card that also provides clutter. No other card in the game currently really fills that role. Ajax is definitely not important. Previously, this archetype was playing a small movement package, specifically Iron Fist, Ghost Spider, and Dagger in the Hazmat, Ajax, and Viper slots here to provide you an additional way to get stats in a way that was very energy efficient at the end of the game. Moving on to my personal picks this week, the Viper buff has me enjoying one of my favorite archetypes, Daredevil Control. This deck list has a small clutter sub package that it looks to utilize to lock its opponent in one lane, often with perfect information from Daredevil on turn 5. And then we set up a win in a second path in a few different ways. We can either goose to lock an opponent out of making big plays there, and we can then add smaller things like Titania and Demon to win it quite easily. We can chop down their big play with Shang-Chi, or we can line up Gamora along with either a Demon or Titania to slam down 17 to 18 points of power on turn 6, often overpowering whatever the opponent is doing there. As far as higher series cards in this deck list go, again, White Widow is pretty important because she provides a unique element of clogging the opponent up. I would say Nico's also pretty crucial as well. She provides a lot of utility for us, as well as a secondary means to get rid of Hood periodically with 2 of her modes. Nocturne is definitely replaceable by another generically good 3 energy card. You could play a tech card like Mobius or Luke Cage, or something else that's interactive, such as Red Guardian. Spider-Ham is also definitely super replaceable in this deck list and any deck list by another 1 energy disruptive card, such as Iceman. My second Jeff's pick this week is definitely susceptible to the Doc Ock Leech 1-2 punch, but otherwise feels very competitive in every other matchup. Strong Guy Surfer has really impressed me with its ability to put out lots of points on the board, even when neither of its namesakes are anywhere to be found. Whether it's Silver Surfer, Strong Guy, Proxima, Gwenpool, and even Dakin and Sebastian Shaw, this deck list has so many dynamic ways to put big numbers into play. It makes it difficult for your opponent to predict exactly which game plan you're going to be executing and how large your cards are going to be on the final turn of the game. This deck list is unfortunately a little bit more on the inaccessible side, though. I would go so far as to say that Dakin, Sebastian Shaw, Gwenpool, and Proxima Midnight are all pretty important for it to be able to function at peak power level. All of these cards allow us to make pretty sizable numbers in play, and your dynamic game plan and consistency is going to go down if you're missing any of them. Makari is the only Series 5 card I call out in here as being easily replaceable, and if she's missing in your collection, I recommend substituting her for America Chavez as another card that synergizes with our growers that we can also play out of our hand early to help make sure that we're getting our hand down to just 1 card or less for Strong Guy's bonus. Finally, we're going to close out this week with a category I'm calling Best in Class, the first deck of which is this Lockjaw variation. To be abundantly clear, the deck lists in this grouping are the best decks featuring a card or an idea, in this case Lockjaw, but they're definitely not a cut above everything else in the format. They have metrics that are reasonable and playable, and maybe these decks get better if they get optimized, but I'm mostly putting them here to showcase cards that I think the community is interested in playing and working with, so you have a starting point if you're looking to play with our latest good boy, for example here. In contrast to the Surfer deck list that we just looked at, I think this Lockjaw build is pretty accessible. The only higher series card I would say is an absolutely must-have for it is Beta Ray Bill, since that Thor, Bill, Jane Foster package adds a lot of consistency to an archetype like this. Red Hulk is definitely easily replaceable with another big 6 energy card, such as Hulk or Giganto, which is the only other higher series card in this deck. Our second deck list in the best in class category this week is Spectrum Ongoing. Specifically, this deck list is the best thing to be doing with Man Thing, to my knowledge, and based on the metrics that we have on Untapped so far. This archetype has a pretty generically good disruptive game plan thanks to Armor, Cosmo, Jean Grey, and Luke Cage, and then you also have a pretty reasonable power output on the last turn of the game, with Spectrum letting you spread stats out all over the board in a way that can often be difficult for your opponent to predict. As far as higher series exchanges go, Man Thing is replaceable in this deck, honestly, even if you wanted to play it and don't have him, as well as Jean Grey. Just substitute in your other favorite ongoing cards with 2, 3, or 4 energy cost. For better and worse, mostly worse, it does look like I was correct in the last couple of weeks when I was talking about Airsham deck lists not really being optimized, and the ones we see emerging this week featuring pretty toxic interactive cards like Leech and Dr. Octopus are definitely a cut above power level that we've seen from other iterations of the past since Airsham dropped. I'll be interested to see if there's something in the format that people can figure out that let this deck not just run rampant, but I honestly wouldn't be surprised if we see this deck continue to optimize and perform better, and maybe even increase from its 30% metagame share as time goes on without direct intervention from Marvel Snap. Have you at home been one of those people that's innovative and found something that you think works in this format? I would love to hear about it in a comment down below. As always, if you enjoy my decks roundup this week, be sure to snap that like button and make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any Marvel Snap game news or roundups like this here several times per week.